Good evening. We are going to now kind of turn to uh, what science has come to recognize as certain I'm going to call them facts uh, through research, but looking at these from a somewhat different point of view, uh, as showing us that there's an immaterial aspect of self which uh, science doesn't recognize, but so many of the researches that science is engaged in modern science surely points in that direction. Not surprisingly, it is fairly difficult for the scientific community to accept some of the implications that we might draw from their observations, largely because they don't have in their theory any mechanism to explain the function of these various things. So I'm going to begin by sharing my screen. We've got a lot of little short videos. Some of them will be somewhat self-explanatory to kind of help us see and establish, some of these key points here. So I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully it's going to work out well today. Okay. And then we have it. So again, the scientific evidence for the soul. And in this case, we're going to look at consciousness and intelligence uh, as kind of this aspect of self, and look to establish it as being independent of the body and the brain. And I know, let's do this. And so what we're going to do in today's presentation, we're going to focus on the scientific evidence that points to consciousness not being a product of the brain, but having an existence independent of the brain. So we're going to look at scientific evidence that points in this direction. Again, you're not going to find likely 99.x% of scientists saying, well, this proves there's a soul or something that is another immaterial aspect of self, because it isn't something that science has so far found a way to kind of measure in its laboratory or laboratories, and therefore is very reluctant to accept things that can't be measured through the conventional devices that we presently have. This independent immaterial aspect has been referred to by different names across religious traditions, such as the soul in Christianity and the Atman in Hinduism. So a lot of different names have been given to it. I want to note, though, that outside of the focus of today's presentation are the many conceptions regarding this immaterial aspect, as described in various religious and philosophical traditions, including Rosicrucianism. And so we know, if you take, some of the conventional notions that we're likely familiar with from Christianity as an example, there's a soul, and upon death, it can maybe go to heaven or go to hell, and depending how the individual lived. There's many theories around it. Obviously, some embrace reincarnation. So we're not going to focus on those, because obviously that is a whole nother field unto itself. So that will be outside of the scope of this conversation. And really, the intent of this presentation is to reasonably demonstrate that consciousness is universal and manifests in all living things without regard to the presence of a brain or the brain size. And I should say, as I mentioned when we were beginning yesterday, what really kind of, at least personally, brought me on this particular quest was a friend who's a very well-educated man and a scientific, quite accomplished in the scientific area, particularly when it comes to the mind and the brain, but happens to be, strongly held atheistic beliefs. And what my efforts over the last 10 or 15 years, just to casually at times, is share with him information that would seem to suggest that intelligence and consciousness are not products of the brain, because we see the various expressions of intelligence and consciousness across so many different forms, that it would seem that if it was dependent on form, we wouldn't find this kind of universal presentation of consciousness, no matter, considering how varied the forms are. So that's kind of what started me on this, and I just wanted to share, some of the things that I think provide evidence for this point. So we're going to look at the conventional scientific viewpoint, which is basically is that the brain generates consciousness. So that's the accepted scientific view of of consciousness. Like the brain generates consciousness. You alter the biochemistry, you give somebody a drug, consciousness changes. There's proof that the brain generates consciousness. Uh, I'd say in many ways it is similar to believing that, the radio components actually generate the music that's coming via your radio, or the things that the podcasts or the things you might see on your TV screen that somehow are generated by that apparatus as compared to being conveyed by that apparatus. But the conventional scientific view is that consciousness is generated by the brain. What they fall back on is that the human brain contains 86 to 100 billion neurons, kind of depending on who's doing the counting, and a network of 100 trillion to 1 quadrillion synaptic connections in the human brain alone, a single individual. So these, tens of millions and trillions of connections. And they'd say the activity, the kind of chemical, electrical activity that's taking place among those synapses and neurons is what's responsible for consciousness. And that's kind of the source of it. This, though, assumption leads to what is in physics is called the hard problem of consciousness. And that literally is how they call it. And that the reason why they said the hard problem is that they said, well, how do elements such as atoms and molecules, which are presumed to lack consciousness, somehow give rise to consciousness? If they themselves don't have it, how does somehow another, that their kind of assemblage of atoms and molecules now all of a sudden produces consciousness? So that is called to be the hard problem of consciousness in physics. How do you get from inanimate, unconscious matter to consciousness and awareness? And that basically is kind of where they're kind of stuck behind that and not really being able to solve it. But of course, human beings, which scientists are, are made up of human beings. There are always some who are thinking a bit beyond the conventional wisdom of a particular age. And what we could describe here as the scientific frontier, or what they call quantum-based theories of consciousness. So basically looking at what has come to be understood about quantum physics and the quantum nature of reality, and this kind of underlying activity that gives rise to the particles and molecules and atoms, that it is perhaps some quantum interactions that create consciousness. And this has been advanced by a number of scientists, but two of the most notable are Roger Penrose, who is a Nobel Prize winner, and Federico Fagon, who is acknowledges the inventor of the microprocessor, which is the basic heart and soul of a computer, which obviously has changed our lives over the last 40 years. So let's look at some of the current evidence that we're going to look at. So evidence of consciousness and intelligence in organisms without a brain. So if the point of view of science is it has to have a brain to produce consciousness, well, as it turns out, there's a number of different entities that would seem to exhibit conscious behavior and intelligence, and they don't have brains. So we're going to look at that group. We're also going to look at evidence from human neuroscience research about the brain itself, and in this case, some folks with only part of a brain. And that's going to be quite fascinating to see. And I think you may be astounded if you're not familiar with this information already. Then we're going to look at, and just very briefly, evidence for free will outside of the brain. So there's been some research that led people to say, well, there is no such thing as free will. Everything's biochemical. And so, but there is evidence, scientific evidence, demonstrative, repeatable scientific evidence that shows that the assumptions do not seem to be accurate based on the premise that basically everything is simply a biochemical response. Then we're going to look at evidence of consciousness and intelligence in creatures with extremely small brains. And personally, this is the thing that has fascinated me for a very long time. And kind of most of what I mentioned I shared with this friend is when you look at creatures, in this case, we're going to just look at some insects because you could look at lots of creatures, but we're going to look at some insects who have extremely small brains. They're like teeny, 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 tiny brains, right? But they do all this complicated stuff. So if in theory, the brain is what gives rise to conscious and intelligence. Well, how do you explain it when the brain is such a tiny, tiny uh, size in relationship actually to a human brain, but demonstrating uh, uh, intelligent behavior that parallels in a smaller context what you find in humans and other animals. So, and lastly, we're just going to point out at the end a little bit of evidence outside of the current scientific mainstream. So. Uh, the first categories all are scientific kind of laboratory kind of evidence. Uh, Again, what's different here, I'd say from a Rosicrucian point of view, is our interpretation of the implications of that evidence. Uh, in many cases, scientists will observe something, be able to repeat it experimentally, but they won't necessarily uh, acknowledge certain implications that that evidence would suggest if it doesn't conform to what is presently accepted in the scientific community. And I say much of that is based on that the traditional scientific community is always looking for a mechanism how something can take place. So, as an example, telepathy, which we might say through our own experiences we've observed, experienced, etc. Well, 99% of scientists are going to say no, that doesn't exist, even though there's lots of anecdotal evidence that it does exist, and actually some laboratory studies that have been done. But because they don't know, well, how could this happen, though? Because there's no mechanism that is understood presently in science of how a thought could be transferred to one person, from one person to another, without any direct communication, without regard to distance, etc. So there's no understanding of a mechanism, and when they don't find a mechanism, they just kind of say, "Oh, we just shut that in a box." And that's so these first several types of evidence here are the facts are acknowledged, but the implications are not accepted. That this means there's a soul or some other kind of non-material aspect of self, but they surely point to something other than the common accepted notion that the brain is what gives rise to intelligence and consciousness. So, anyway, we're going to go in here. We're going to look at initially organisms without a brain. I'm going to look at plants, flatworms, jellyfish, single-cell organisms, slime mold, if you might enjoy learning more about slime mold, not in your basement, obviously. So I'm not going to spend much on plants because there are presentations that part of Rosicrucian TV that touch on the clear examples of intelligent activity or behavior by plants. Uh, and so generally, it's looked at examples of electrical signaling and chemical signaling between plants and memory-like behavior. And there's just lots of evidence on this. And I say up on Rosicrucian TV, there's, I think, at least one presentation on the kind of intelligence in plants. And if you go up to YouTube, you could just find dozens and dozens of videos that are, of scientific experiments clearly evidencing what was seen to be intelligent behavior on plants which don't have a brain. And obviously, they would be at a real disadvantage if they had a brain because plants have to tolerate having half of their bodies eaten. Now, if we had half of our body eaten, and particularly it involved our head, we'd be dead. Plants, part of their regular routine is having parts of their body eaten. So nature has not centered this intelligent behavior processing in a quote unquote brain, which obviously would not function very well since it would have to be susceptible to being eaten regularly. So I just recommend researching that further. I want to take us into something that we generally haven't touched upon as much because it's quite fascinating when you look at this evidence. So we're going to start with flatworms. Now I'm going to count on that you're going to be able to hear the sound of this. These are going to generally be very brief videos. We have quite a few of them, and they're brief. And so flatworms are, as you'll see, they do have brains, but you'll learn a little bit more about how they get along without a brain as well.
The planarian is a saltwater and freshwater flatworm known primarily for its regenerative abilities. Cut off their tail and they'll grow it back. Cut them in half and they'll become two whole flatworms, even though they have a distinctive head region with a brain in it. What's really amazing is that even after losing its brain, a planarian can remember things from before it was beheaded. Planarians are pretty simple animals, but they do have brains that control things like sensory reception. And this brain is considered a true brain, not just a bundle of neurons. It has two lobes, it controls nervous function throughout the body, and it has specialized regions. This means their brains probably look a lot how ours once did. And this makes them a great analog for studying brain evolution, as well as asking fundamental questions about things like memory. It's hard to know what memories a planarian has, of course, but you can train them to perform new, unnatural behaviors, and then see if they retain that memory under different conditions. Planarians have simple needs. They like raw meat, and they dislike light and change, which I get it. They're willing to get over their light aversion for a tasty meal, but if other things change at the same time, they just kind of freak out. Like if you take them out of petri dishes with smooth glass and put them into textured petri dishes, they are too weirded out at first to go for a piece of liver in the middle with a bright light shining on it. But if you put the flatworms in textured dishes for a while beforehand, you can passively train them to be familiar with that environment. Then when you add the spotlight and liver, they go for it quickly, providing researchers with enough evidence of successful training. And when scientists have done this training regimen, they found planarians can retain such memories for at least 14 days. That raises the question, of course, what happens when you cut off their heads? We know that within a week, the flatworms grow new, usable heads they can eat with and everything, and they can make it that long without eating, so they're fine. But presumably, if you have a brain, that's where your memories are. So since the 1950s, scientists have been trying to figure out what happens when the flatworms lose and then regrow their brains. And most strangely, they seem to remember previous training. In a 2013 study, for example, the trained flatworms approached the food faster, even though their training happened with their former heads. The difference between trained and untrained planarians was not as big as it was pre-decapitation, so the researchers concluded that this memory retention isn't quite 100%. But still, it's bizarre that they could remember the training at all. As for how they retain those memories, well, we don't really know.
So, again, the idea in materialistic science is that the brain is the source of memory, is the house of memory and reasoning, etc. And what this is demonstrating is that even after the brain has been removed, there's somehow retained information about the prior training. And the example is kind of further carried out and said, well, it would be as much like when we talk about someone developing muscle memory for a certain behavior, but we look at that muscle memory as being in the brain, not actually in the arm or the leg. It's in the brain. So that's what's so confounding about the results of these experiments with flatworms, so this type of flatworm, is that clearly the information is not solely stored in his brain, because with the new brain, it still recognizes that kind of past training. It's not perfect, but it does it repeatedly. So we're now going to look at jellyfish. So jellyfish don't have brains. So again, we're just initially harping on this thesis. You say that the brain is what gives rise to consciousness and intelligence. Well, here's something again without a brain, and you're going to see it demonstrates consciousness and awareness and responsiveness and intelligence.
A recent study has unveiled the remarkable learning abilities of box jellyfish, specifically the Tripedalia cystophora species. These gelatinous creatures, despite their lack of a traditional brain, have demonstrated an astonishing aptitude for adapting their behavior based on past experiences. This discovery has the scientific community buzzing with excitement and could offer crucial insights into the evolution of learning in animals. The research, led by Anders Garm, a biologist at the University of Copenhagen, and his team, delves into the intriguing world of these brainless marine organisms. What's particularly captivating about box jellyfish is their complex visual system, boasting a remarkable 24 eyes, which sets them apart from their more simplistic jellyfish relatives. However, beneath their translucent exteriors, these creatures are governed by a distributed network of neurons. To investigate their learning capabilities, scientists confronted the challenge of finding a behavior they could train the jellyfish to perform in a controlled laboratory environment. They honed in on a behavior observed in the wild, the rapid about-face maneuver executed by box jellyfish when approaching mangrove roots in the water. The reason behind this maneuver was puzzling. How do they gauge distances when water clarity fluctuates due to silt? The hypothesis emerged that these creatures must learn to adapt to shifting environmental conditions. To test this theory, researchers created an ingenious experiment. They lined the insides of buckets with alternating dark and light stripes to mimic the contrasting environment around mangrove roots. When the stripes represented optimal water clarity, the box jellyfish expertly avoided collisions with the bucket walls. However, when the contrast was reduced, the jellyfish started colliding. Incredibly, after just a few collisions, the jellyfish altered their behavior. Within a mere 8 minutes, they swam further from the pattern on the bucket walls and intensified their about-face maneuvers, showcasing their remarkable ability to learn from experience. But the revelations didn't stop there. The researchers decided to dig even deeper, removing visual neurons from the jellyfish and studying them in isolation. To simulate collisions, they showed these neurons striped images while administering a mild electrical pulse. Astonishingly, within roughly 5 minutes, the isolated neurons initiated the signal that would cause a complete box jellyfish to execute the about-face maneuver. The implications of this study are profound. Scientists are hailing this as a significant step forward in our understanding of the origins of learning. Only the third time that associative learning has been convincingly demonstrated in cnidarians, a group encompassing sea anemones, hydras, and jellyfish, this study stands out for its inclusion of physiological data. Moreover, the results suggest that box jellyfish may possess some form of short-term memory, as they can adjust their behavior based on prior experiences.
So what we see here is an example, from a Rosicrucian point of view, that intelligence and consciousness is everywhere, right? We refer to cosmic consciousness as being universal. It manifests through different forms, but is universal, just as we can see in the cells of our body, where the cells within our bodies carry out literally really millions of functions per second at the cellular level without our conscious intervention, but they're responding to their environments, they're excreting, they're taking in nutrients, they're avoiding substances that are harmful. So if we kind of look at this as evidence that don't be confused by the form, the intelligence is universal. Right? As different as these forms are from ourselves and from maybe traditional animals that we're thinking about, but they all manifest this intelligence of the cosmic. This one is actually quite interesting, and by the way, you'll find this one has a very pleasant music. These are single cells, right? So you're going to see these single cells and actually demonstrating a range of behaviors, no brain involved, right? So let's take a look at this.
Can a single cell be sophisticated enough to be capable of making a complex decision? Over a century ago, the American zoologist Herbert Spencer Jennings conducted an experiment suggesting that this might indeed be the case.
The hierarchy of behaviors which Jennings observed, I felt, was very important because it indicated that the organism was, in some sense, and quote unquote, changing its mind as to what to do, and very few other instances where we have such clear indication that individual cells are capable of that kind of change of mind.
Jennings was studying Stentor roselli, a member of a group of single-celled organisms called ciliates. Trumpet-shaped and unusually large for a single cell, Stentor like to stick to debris via a holdfast and have little hairs called cilia, which they use to swim and to create a vortex around their oral cavities to feed. Jennings' experiment was fairly straightforward, but the behaviors he observed were not.
He used a fine capillary pipette to squirt carmine dye at the oral cavity, and that was the stimulation he used to annoy them. What Jennings observed was a sequence in which the organisms first bent away from this irritation. They also altered the direction of their ciliary rotation so that instead of ingesting the particles, they would expel them. And then when that didn't work, they contracted sharply down to their holdfast. And finally, they would get completely fed up and they would pull up their holdfast and swim off. To me, what was fascinating about it is the suggestion that actually individual cells, if you know how to ask them the right questions or annoy them in the right way, will actually reveal that they are more sophisticated and more autonomous than we realize.
However, subsequent efforts to replicate Jennings' experiments failed, and his findings were discredited and largely forgotten to science.
It kept bugging at me. So eventually I tracked down the paper and I discovered that the experiments had been undertaken on a different kind of ciliate.
So, with then graduate student Joseph Dexter and then postdoctoral fellows Sudhakaran Prabhakaran, the three Harvard Medical School systems biologists set out to replicate Jennings' original experiment. Over the course of several years, they located Stentor roselli test subjects and set up an experimental apparatus to repeatedly deliver an environmental irritant, in this case microplastic beads. And then they recorded the organism's responses.
Well, what we saw was every single one of the avoidance behaviors, but the behavior we found was very much more variable than Jennings had reported. And the most difficult part, I think, of the analysis was finding how to look at this from a statistical point of view.
Where observation failed, math triumphed.
So what came out of the statistical analysis was really exactly what Jennings had claimed. There's a hierarchy of behaviors. So if you ask whether alteration and bending happen before contraction, then the statistical evidence for this across many organisms is extremely compelling. Stentor roselli in this case is deciding whether to alter its cilia or bend or contract, or to keep on contracting or to detach. And that gives it a quality of autonomous behavior, which is in fact what Jennings was so interested in himself.
So why would scientists at a medical school be interested in these unusual organisms?
We tend to think of, say, the process of development of, say, a human being from a single fertilized egg as being programmed, which tends to give the idea that the cells sort of know what to do. And I think what Jennings' experiments to me suggest is that part of that program might actually be giving the cells a lot more autonomy for making up their own minds what to do in the context they find themselves in. And I think that's becoming clearer from the evidence we have about the way cancers grow and the way in which, say, the immune system does its work. But I think it is also relevant to how the organism constructs itself from a single cell. So I think this alerts us to the possibility of much more complex behaviors at the level of a single cell.
So, again, I think it brings us back to recognizing that we live in this kind of sea of intelligence. It's all around us. Everything embodies it. It's easier to observe in living things when it's studied with an open mind. And so we can kind of look at life with a sort of greater reverence, so to speak, and recognizing there is this one universal intelligence that's manifesting all these different ways. And it's all around us. We're part of it. And there's, in a sense, no place without it. So now we're going to look at the last thing of this kind of aspect on slime molds. And these are slime molds that do mazes, which I guess you could say is amazing.
This is a pretty simple maze. It shouldn't be too hard for you to solve. Of course, you're pretty smart. You've got 86 billion neurons at your disposal. You're a member of the most intelligent species on the planet. But what if you were a pulsating wad of yellow goo? I'm gonna let my friend Amy from Deep Look introduce you.
This is Physarum polycephalum, a slime mold, which sounds like something you might find on stale bread, but it's not a fungus. It's a jelly-like protist. You can think of it like one big cell holding millions of nuclei, and they might not seem like much, but slime molds are smarter than they look. Just watch.
This slime mold can solve mazes. It does so by first exploring every path, and then when it's found the food at either end, it retracts any paths that don't connect the points. Solving a maze involves remembering where you've been. Where does a single-celled ball of goo hold memories? Physarum does this by leaving chemical trails to mark dead ends, so it can remember where it's already explored. When slime molds are presented with a maze that has more than one solution, they'll even figure out the shortest one. No matter the shape, they'll almost always connect distributed food sources by the shortest path. If that doesn't impress you, realize that once you start adding points, mapping efficient networks is an incredibly complex problem. The humans need big computers and complex math to solve. This living ooze is redefining what it means to be intelligent. They've even been able to map the rail system of Tokyo and the major highways of the United Kingdom.
So yes, quite amazing. So now we're going to switch to this. I'm sure you're going to find fascinating if you're not already familiar with this. This is kind of the neuroscience research, and we're going to look at something called. Now, this is my pronunciation. Please don't, maybe use it because it may not be right. Hydranencephaly. You think of hydra, water, and brain. Split brain surgery. We look at split brain research, and then consciousness in vegetative states. So let's go here. This is, I don't know about you, but it really kind of floored me when I came across some of this information. Oh, by the way, yes, evidence of free will independent of brain. I'm going to touch on too. So, okay, so this, by the way, I want you to, in the credit, so to speak, I make reference to the YouTube video that I pulled this out of because he's a neurosurgeon. It's about a 30-minute presentation, and his title is Evidence for the Soul, or Scientific Evidence for the Soul. He's totally on it, and he didn't start out there, but through his research and his work as a neurosurgeon, he's come to certain interesting conclusions. So the first topic is going to be this hydranencephaly. So let's listen to this.
I did neurosurgery at the University of Miami and have been at Stony Brook on faculty there since 1991. And I've done about 7,000 brain operations. And I've learned a fair amount in not only academically, but just in personal experience as to how the brain works and how the mind relates to the brain. I saw a number of things over my career that made me question the traditional materialist way of understanding how the brain works. The patients I'm going to show you here are real people. I've changed their names, but they're very real people. The picture on, I guess it would be which side, on your left is an MRI of the brain of a young lady, and the black there is spinal fluid. The brain is the gray stuff there. She's missing about 2/3 of her brain. That's the way she was born. The image alongside of it is a normal brain for comparison. When she was a young baby, we scanned her and found this, and we were rather pessimistic with her family about her chances of having a normal life. She grew up a completely normal person. She was on the honor roll in high school. If you met her today, you'd say, yeah, she's a bright young lady. She's perfectly fine. Missing 2/3 of her brain. This is a little boy named Joshua. He was born missing also about 2/3 of his brain. And he is that, again, that black space there is just water. He was evaluated by the ethics committee at my hospital, and they recommended that he not be fed when he was born because he was in such terrible shape that it'd be better if he passed away. We rescinded that order and fed him, and he's now graduating from high school, perfectly normal young man, plays sports, he's a great kid. Maggie is a young lady who was in a gifted program when she was young. She's a brilliant young woman, missing most of her cerebellum and part of the central regions of her brain. She has had to have some surgery to take care of fluid pressure there, but she's done very well. She has a master's degree in English literature, and she's a published musician. Nicholas is a little boy who's quite handicapped. He has cerebral palsy, and he's missing both hemispheres of his brain. The only part of his brain he has is his brainstem. He is handicapped. He can't speak. He can't walk, but he's fully conscious. He's kind of funny. He laughs. He cries. He's emotionally a normal person. even though he is handicapped, even though he's missing his entire brain hemispheres.
So what that really kind of, I think, points out to us, you really don't need what we look upon as our brain in order to have consciousness or awareness. The brain is not creating it. All of these cases, this conclusion, at least that seems evident to me, and well as obviously the speaker, the brain is not what gives rise to consciousness. One can have a fully conscious individual with really just a half or less of their brain being intact. They may be limited in terms of how they can operate their bodies, in terms of being able to direct electrical energy and how the brain kind of directs through kind of unconscious processes our bodies. But nevertheless, I think kind of astounding when based on the assumptions we normally have. So this is he's gonna talk a little bit about some split brain surgery, which I think you'll find interesting.
Some of the most interesting work along this line has been done by Roger Sperry and his colleagues. Sperry won the Nobel Prize for this work. Back in the mid-20th century, an operation was developed for people who would have a seizure in one hemisphere of the brain that would spread to the other hemisphere. And these were catastrophic seizures that were very difficult to control. So what Sperry, an operation that was developed, not by Sperry, but by others, was to cut the brain in half, essentially, so that if a seizure started in one half of the brain, it couldn't spread to the other half, and that made the seizures much easier to control and much milder. And it was called a corpus callosotomy, and we still do that surgery today. So the hemispheres of the brain are functionally disconnected. And Sperry, who was a neuroscientist, realized that you could study what each hemisphere does because they're disconnected. So he did a lot of wonderful work, and the left hemisphere controls speech, the right hemisphere controls spatial orientation, and he got the Nobel Prize for that. But one thing that he noticed, and I've noticed too, is that people who've had their brains cut in half are pretty normal people. As you meet these people, the brains are cut in half, and they're walking and talking, they feel normal. They have less seizures than they used to have. It would be the same thing as if someone just took a chainsaw and cut the laptop in half, and it still worked just fine.
So here's going to be another illustration.
The follow-up research on that is something that still gives me chills, and I learned about this decades ago, and I think it's among the most fascinating results in cognitive neuroscience. Justine Sergent was a researcher at McGill in Montreal, worked about 20 years after Sperry, and she studied people with split brain surgery. And what she did was she found a way to present pictures of things, like pictures of arrows, to each hemisphere separately at the same time. So she put arrows up that the right hemisphere would see one arrow, the left hemisphere would see the other arrow, but no part of the brain saw both arrows. One half saw one arrow, the other half saw the other arrow. And she asked the people, are the arrows pointing in the same direction or not? And they always got it right. But how could they compare arrows when no part of the brain saw both arrows? So she concluded that there was something in the mind that wasn't in the brain.
So let's go a little bit further here. Now, this is something about obviously individual in a vegetative state, which usually feels some sort of brain injury or some severe illness, high fever, whatever the case may be, and they lapse into what we call a vegetative state. This one has a lot of really implications for our own kind of lives and with family and others potentially. But I think you'll nevertheless find it interesting for the kind of scientific aspect of it beyond that.
Adrian Owen is a researcher, I think he's currently in Indiana, he was at Cambridge in England. They had a fascinating study in patients in persistent vegetative state. Persistent vegetative state is the deepest level of coma. It's just a step above brain death. And it happens when people have had very severe brain injuries from lack of oxygen or from motor vehicle accidents. And it's called vegetative because it's been assumed that these people are basically vegetables, meaning that they have no mind. They're just a body, and there's no mind left. Some of you may recall the Terry Schiavo stuff that went on about 20 years ago. She was in persistent vegetative state. What Owen did is he put patients in MRI machines and did functional MRI imaging that shows brain activity. And he would ask them to think about things with a headset. He'd say, think about walking across the room, or think about your family, or think about playing tennis. And they would show patterns of brain activation in their very damaged brain. And he then did that with normal volunteers and found the patterns were identical, implying that they were understanding what he was talking about. And then what he did, he was very clever, he asked the same questions, but he mixed up the words so they didn't make any sense. Instead of think about walking across the room, he'd say room across walking about think. Doesn't make any sense. And the brain was silent. So these people were understanding the questions he was asking, even though their brains were practically destroyed. And he actually found, he and other people have replicated his work, that about 40% of people in persistent vegetative state show clear evidence of being able to communicate. There are people who can do mathematics in persistent vegetative state. You ask them, what's 9 plus 6? You count. When you hit 15, the brain lights up. There are people who can tell their family histories. You know, is your brother's name George? The brain will light up. So you can communicate with people in the deepest level of coma in many cases.
So this is a very interesting one coming up here again. They're both very brief, and it's the question of free will. So there's been research has shown, and it's been cited many times, where before a person actually consciously goes to do a certain action, that somewhat less than a second before, there's already some activity in the brain before they actually are consciously aware they're going to cut on the light, as an example. And what people have basically said based on that research, oh, clearly there's no free will because the brain is making you cut on the light. You don't realize the brain's making you cut on the light, but that's what's happening. And so there's a gentleman who we're going to be introduced to here who's done research on this and looking at this issue of free will and ultimately of free won't, but you'll hear what that means in a moment.
Wilder Penfield also studied free will, and he did a very interesting study. During these awake brain operations, he would simulate the surface of a patient's brain, and if you stimulate the right place, you can make them do things, like make them raise their arm. He would ask them during the surgery to occasionally raise their arm themselves without him stimulating them. And you can't feel your brain. Your brain has no sensory things, and the patients are under surgical drapes, so they can't see what he's doing. And he would ask them, when your arm goes up, I want you to tell me whether you did it or whether I did it. And they always got it right. Hundreds of thousands of trials of this in 1,100 patients. No one ever missed it. No one ever got it wrong. And he concluded then that he couldn't find any place in the brain that simulated free will. That free will wasn't in the brain, that you could always tell, this is my will. This is not someone doing it to me. So free will is not a brain function.
So now we're going to look at another little extension of that same research.
Benjamin Libet did probably the most famous research on free will. And what Libet found, and it would take a while to go into details about how he did his experiments, they were quite ingenious. But he would record electrical signals from the scalp, and these are people who haven't had any surgery, they're just normal volunteers. And what he found was that when you decide to do something simple, there tends to be a spike in brain activity that happens about a half second before you decide. Like if you're going to turn on a light switch, about a half second before you turn on the light switch, your brain spikes. And that's before you're aware that you're going to turn it on. So and that seems at first glance that everything is driven by your brain. Your brain makes you do it. and you don't really have any free will. It's all just chemicals driving you to do things. So, but he was a very clever researcher, and what he did is he asked people to veto your decision. That is, that when you're about to flip the switch, say, no, I'm not going to do it. I've changed my mind. And the veto didn't have a spike in the brain. So he said, it's not so much that he showed there was free will, but they showed there was free won't. So that is that your brain, and he commented, he was a religious man, and he said, this is the traditional religious way of understanding human motivation, that we're hit with temptations from our brain, but we have the free choice to do it or not. Because the free choice to do it or not did not have any new brain activity at all. It was independent of the brain. So the brain keeps hitting you with these things, have that extra piece of cake. So, but you can say yes or no, and you can't blame your brain.
There's one with a lot to think about. So now we're going to turn to creatures with extremely small brains, really small brains. So we kind of started off with things with no brains. And then we kind of now move to, we're basically people, who were born with not a full brain, a complete brain. So now we're going to turn to things with extremely small brains that do some really crazy stuff, right? And we're going to look at these, desert ants, army ants, weaver ants, and honeybees. And, there's lots of other categories of insects that could be featured. It's just obviously interest of time. We don't want to do an hour just on the insects, unfortunately. So I'm just going to focus on ants and honeybees. And so, take a look at these ants.
This desert ant wants to go here for lunch. Because she's in the desert, there is no scent trail, so how does our little ant find her way home?
I know.
Well, some German and Swiss scientists think that ants have pedometers in their brains.
Yeah.
Meaning maybe there are brain cells inside a desert ant that record every step the ant takes as she walks out.
6, 7, 8, 9.
And then when it's time to go home, they just reverse and count backwards.
9, 4, 3.
It's a nice idea, but how do you prove it? Okay, scientists designed an ingenious experiment.
Yeah.
Yes, which lets us literally see these pedometers at work. So we'll take an ant, we'll call it...
Ant number 1.
Okay, so ant number 1, we want to watch you take 10 steps to the food source.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
And then 10 steps home. Now, could you just go back to the apple? Thank you. Now, ant number 2. She also marched to the food source, but when she got there, they grabbed her and super glued little pig bristles. They're kind of like stilts. So now she's a much taller ant, and therefore every step she takes will be that much longer. Careful, careful.
This is absolutely necessary.
And finally, ant number 3. She also walks 10 steps to the food. Again, they grab her. This time they do something a little gruesome.
What do you mean gruesome?
We're cutting your legs off at the knees.
What?
Sometimes we've all got to make small sacrifices for science. So because your legs are now much smaller, from now on, every step you take will be much shorter.
I feel all stampy.
Okay, now comes the fun part. When everybody was ready, the ants were released. Off they go. And here's what happened. The stilty ant, she walked 10 steps home and stopped.
I'm out.
No, you're not.
What?
Because each of her steps is now so much longer, she'd gone right past the entrance.
What the?
The stumpy ant, she also walked 10 steps home and stopped.
I'm home.
But because each of her steps is now so much shorter, she only got part way back.
I want my legs back.
Sorry. And the last ant who was left alone, she gets home
I'm out.
with no problem, strongly suggesting that all these ants were somehow counting their steps. And just in case you're not convinced, that same day, scientists move all three groups of ants back into the nest for the night. And the next day, all the ants were marched off to get food using their new legs. The stumpies took lots of steps. The stilties took fewer steps. The regulars took regular steps. And when it was time to come home, all the ants, all three groups went straight home. Their pedometers apparently had adjusted to their new leg size. So ants, it really seems hard to avoid this conclusion,
I'm out.
do have pedometers in their heads, or another way to say it is...
Ants down. Yeah. I want my legs back.
Anyway, it's funny. So we got another one here. This is kind of brief, and it's clearly a made-for-YouTube video coming up.
You've never seen ants do this before. They're building a living bridge to launch an attack. Thousands of ants connect to one another to form a structure strong enough to cross gaps and reach a wasp nest. This is not random. It's a perfectly coordinated assault. One lone wasp spots the intruders and immediately strikes, using her powerful mandibles to eliminate the ants and reclaim the water source. But this isn't just a single fight. The ants are organized, relentless, and out for protein. As the bridge holds steady, more ants advance toward the nest. They overpower the adult wasps and begin carrying off the larvae, a rich source of nutrients for their own colony. Despite their tiny size, their collective intelligence and endurance make them an unstoppable force. Outnumbered and overwhelmed, the wasps are left with no choice but to flee, while the ants march back in victory, larvae in their jaws. A true masterclass in strategy, brought to you by nature.
So just in case you're not clear, that rope was just all ants. And I think we've likely all heard someplace another about army ants. Well, those are army ants. There's another formal term for them. But that structure was just the bodies of ants. And they can build it up to go vertical because, as we know, ants can move and leverage much more than their own body weight. But look at the intelligence there. They create it. They make it go all the way up to the wasp nest. They fight off the wasp. They go get their larva, which is the food source, and they bring it back. So their brains are like so tiny, and they're doing all that. What's amazing, if you think about it, how much computing power one would need to replicate that behavior. I mean, just simply even being able to operate eyes and legs, right? As we see the robots that are being created nowadays, and just to get them to do some very simple things, an enormous amount of computing power goes behind it. But then to work collectively as a group and do what they do, and their brains are sort of a dot size in reality. So, okay, now we're going to look at have a band called the Weaver Ant, and they do some interesting stuff also, very ingenious ones.
This weaver ant is carrying its larva on an important journey. Weaver ants are tree dwellers, so they don't dig nests below ground like other ant species. Building a new home up here requires one of the most extraordinary examples of social cooperation in the animal kingdom. Hundreds of ants draw 4 leaves together to form the basic superstructure. Then multiple chains of up to 12 workers bridge the gaps between the leaves. Powerful mandibles and strong tarsal claws haul the leaves together. But they need a permanent solution to secure the walls. Which is where the larva comes in. It secretes sticky silk, securing the edges of the nest, like a living tube of glue. Numerous larvae are used to build a football-sized nest, which will house the colony's queen. They must slowly guide her to her new home.
So we're going to wrap up with honeybees, and this really it's worth it staying to the end because these honeybees are just amazing and you're going to really like them. And there's a disclaimer at the beginning of this video, which I will read for you if you can't see it. It says, "True facts is not appropriate for children, nor for adults who don't act like children." So you can think about that. Okay, so here we go. Bees.
If you've ever seen a bee, you've probably noticed that they're not the largest of animals, and thusly are endowed with a brain suitable for their smallness. Here it is, the brain of a bee. I mean, honestly, it looks fairly large on the screen like that. But this Xbox controller, which is apparently what controls a bee, only has around 960,000 neurons in it. Compare that to the 100 billion or so neurons in a human brain. You see that right there? No? Well, that's the bee brain to scale. Anyway, with stats like that, you might expect a bee to suck at Scrabble, which they do. But they can remember the directions to a flower a mile away. Not sure I could do that. And they can learn which flowers have the good sauce. This bee right here, for example, learned that those yellow third-grade arts and crafts flowers had the better nectar to drink, while the blue ones had the better pollen to rub all over. The best day of that pipe cleaner's life. I know what you're thinking. Big deal. Learning to tell flowers apart is like the main business of being a bee. Of course they're going to toss a couple 100,000 neurons at something important like that. But what about if things get a bit more complicated? See this puck? Well, in the middle of this puck, there's a divot with some sugar juice in it. And bees, they love the sugar juice. Now, of course, if you put a cap over top that sugar juice, you get some bummed-out bees. But if you take that cap and cover just a little bit of that food hole, and then each time the bee comes back, you cover it up a little bit more until it's totally covered. You get some bees that maybe complain on Yelp about the restaurant going to shit, but also bees that gradually figure out that you can push that cap out the way. And once you light that fire, some of them really get into the pushing. All right, Millie, you did it. You can stop now. Pretty clever, these bees. But if you train them on a different shape cap, and then present them with both kinds of caps, they'll push the shape they were trained on first, regardless of which one is covering up the sugar hole. So they're learning, but they're not quite getting the full picture. But pushing things out the way is pretty normal for a bee. Flowers like that of the black locust don't just give up the pollen. You have to force it open. So what about learning something new that doesn't involve pushing? Here you have some flowers, I'm doing air quotes. They've got a hole in the middle with sugar in it, and the whole thing is under a clear cover. But there's a string attached that you can pull to get at it. Now you give this setup to a bunch of bumblebees and not much happens. A lot of buzzing around. I mean, might be because the flowers look like crap. Didn't even draw petals on them. I know it's scientists, didn't have the balls to go to art school, but still. Anyway, you might find a rare bee, a 1 in 100 sort of thing, that can figure this thing out on the first go. But you know those kind of bees, getting drunk the night before the SATs sort of bees. But most of the rest of us, them, need a little help. But what you can do is train them by gradually pushing the flower under the cover, and that way they learn to pull on the string to get the juice. Not bad, right? And listen, once they learn it, they're champs at it. I mean, you want to give them a job. But look at this. You take another bee that doesn't know how to do it, put that bee in a box, and let it watch the trained bee pull the string. Now let that bee out the box, and you know what? It friggin' learned by watching. Now the trained bee can still do some things that this one can't. Like if you add extra string so the flower doesn't move right away, the trained bee keeps pulling until it works. The one who learned by watching just kind of gives up. so some things aren't getting across. But in this way, they can teach each other some very complex things. Here's a bee trained to do a two-step puzzle where you only get the reward at the end. And again, another bee can learn just by watching. Looks like a bit of an annoying student. Like it's right up in there. Oh, now he's gone for a vape. All right, I'm back. Blue thing, red thing, got it. I know what you're thinking. What about balls? Listen, what you've heard is true. Bees love balls. Like before I even show you stuff about how smart they are, you should know that bees really love balls. If you make a clear path from a bee's nest to food, nothing in the way. But to get there, the bees have to walk past what is essentially a bee-sized Chuck E. Cheese ball pit. They stop and they play with those friggin' balls. Not for some reward or anything like that. They play with balls. So it's not surprising that you can train a bee to play one round of mini-golf. And look at how they train them, with the little bee puppet on a stick. And when they put the ball in the middle, they get a sugar snack. And they eventually get the hang of it. Look at this one. She throws it so hard she does a somersault. And she's like, come on, it hit the middle. Where's my sugar? Anyway, now you have the trained bee teach a novice bee how to put the ball in a hole. But this time you have 3 balls, and the 2 closest ones are glued down, so it has to use the farthest one. Now you let the novice bee try it on its own, and you don't glue down any of the balls. And you know what? It uses the ball that was closest to the middle, the one that gets you the treat the fastest, even though it was trained on a different ball. That's innovation. Now this allows knowledge to spread through an entire colony. It's bees teaching other bees. That's what this shows, how that string pulling skill from before went from A to B to B to B. Where were we? Oh, right. It makes sense that bees can share knowledge. I mean, bees are social butterflies. Well, I mean, they're bees, but they all live together and they have to have some complicated roommate meetings, like who's going to get the groceries, or in this example, how to choose the location of a new home. Now, out of 10,000 bees or so, only a couple hundred of them are the scouts. And the scouts go off and look for a good location, maybe a nice hole. Now, if they find something, they come back with directions. But they don't blab about it, they do it through interpretive dance. It's like if a mime had to give directions to the porta potty at Coachella. Here's how it works. They do this sort of figure-8 thing, right? And when they go through the center, they shake their ass. This already packs in a bunch of info. It's like the Morse code of twerking. The direction they move in while they shake it corresponds to the direction of the location. Check it out. They're doing this on a vertical surface. The up direction means straight towards the sun. Down is away from the sun. So this direction here is like 5 o'clock away from the sun. Now, the distance to the location is how long they shake it. It's roughly 1,000 meters for every second of shaking. Apparently, they bought into the metric system. Bullshit. Now, you might be thinking, how the hell do these bees know how far they flew? Well, at one point, they thought the bees were measuring the energy that they used to get there. So they put tiny weights on the bees to see if it changed their estimates. And you know what? It mainly proved you shouldn't put weights on bees. Now there's a bunch of bees with muscular calves walking around. Another time, they put these tents up as landmarks on the way from a hive to a feeder. And then they changed the number of landmarks, which seemed to confuse some of the bees. So what now? Bees can count? Well, it seems they can, especially lower numbers. Here's one avoiding 4 and landing on 2. Here's one they taught to tell the difference between 11 and 12. You can give them 2 scenarios and train them to pick the larger one or the smaller one in this scenario. Look at it go back and forth just to be sure. Perfectionist bee. And if you train it on picking the larger number, it won't just pick the one with more shapes. It'll also pick one with the same number of shapes, but where the shapes themselves are bigger. It's like the concept of larger. And look at this. If you train them to pick the smaller thing, you recognize that nothing is smaller than something. I mean, that's the concept of 0. In this one, if the bee sees yellow shapes, it's trained to go inside and look for the panel with 1 less than the number of shapes outside. Friggin' subtraction. If the color of the shapes is blue, the bee knows to add 1 to the number. I mean, they can do math. You probably only knew about their spelling. Kill me. But discrete counting doesn't seem to be the thing that helps them judge distances. Instead, they seem to use something called optical flow, which is kind of like the rate that things go by in your visual field. And if you know that this is how bees measure things, you can kind of screw with them. You put them in a tunnel, for example, with stripes on the floor. As it passes over the stripes, it measures the distance and has an appropriate X shaking. Now you do the same thing, except in this one, the stripes are moving. So as the bee flies, it thinks it's covering a hell of a lot more ground. And it tells its buddies about a location that's miles away. Meanwhile, you put a horizontal stripe and nothing changes while you fly over it. They don't know how far they went. And this explains, by the way, why bees will often drown if they fly over still water. Anyway, in addition to distance and direction, there's one more thing that seems to be communicated in this dance. The bee's estimate of how good the location is that it's found seems to be related to how often it does the dance in a row. If it thinks it's found something great, it just keeps going. And then there's bees like this one that don't seem very enthused. It flew like 3 feet and found a shoe. Now, the reason for going on and on about a good location is because the bees eventually have to pick one location for their new home. So these dances aren't just about the directions, it's about marketing. If you found a good location, you try and convince other scouts to check it out, and then dance like you do until there's enough to make the decision. And listen, since you've stayed around this long, I'll tell you one other thing. All of this communication about distance and location and quality mainly happen inside a hive, in the dark. Mic drop. A tiny little bee mic drop.
So there we go. Just as a reference, types of evidence still outside of the mainstream of scientific research, and that would be near-death experiences, which also clearly provide evidence, perhaps convincing for some, maybe not for everyone, evidence of that there's consciousness beyond the brain and the body, and then also the spontaneous recall of past lives by children. So those, neither one of these really, even though they're studied by scientists, but they're still very far outside of the academic mainstream or the scientific mainstream. So, and obviously deserve time of their own. So that's kind of it. What I would, at least my takeaway from these things is recognizing that, this intelligence, this divine intelligence, it is just immanent in everything, and it's all about us. It responds to the different physical kind of organisms that it's kind of expressed through. It's back to our Rosicrucian early monographs. I think in the Atria, where they talk about, it's like an electric current that lights up different kinds of bulbs. Some are bright, some are dim, some are green, some are blue, some are etc. So this same intelligence is indivisible, right? The same intelligence is there no matter where you see it. It is there, and when we're the quote coming from the Christian New Testament, where it says, basically, life, this intelligence, in which we live, move, and have our being. So we're surrounded by this, and there's really the evidence that has nothing to do in terms of its origin with the brain or the material side of it. As you saw that little illustration of the bee's brain in comparison to a human brain, and looking at what we just saw demonstrated this. So anyway, good night. Thank you for sticking in there for those on the East Coast, and on the West Coast, I guess you have a nice dinner, and God bless and peace profound.